Hello. So far in Exploring Christianity, A Journey of Faith, we've been looking at the Bible as a whole. Today we're going to focus specifically on the Old Testament and ask the question, is the Old Testament obsolete? Spoiler alert, no, I do not think the Old Testament is obsolete. I think the Old Testament is amazing. It's just packed with action and drama, and it's where we meet God for the first time. I just love it. I'm hoping to convince you today to give it a chance if you haven't already done so. So let's start by looking at the top 5 reasons you often hear that we should not bother reading the Old Testament. Number 5, it is the Jewish Bible. 4, it's about primitive people and has no bearing on modern people. 3, it was written before people really knew God. 2, the Old Testament God was an angry and jealous God and is not the loving God of the New Testament. And the number 1 reason the Old Testament doesn't matter anymore, the entire Old Testament was invalidated when Jesus came and gave us the new covenant. Now let's take a closer look at these. Number 5. The Old Testament describes events that start with the creation of the heavens and stop about 400 years before Jesus' birth. And so it does not contain content occurring after Christianity split off from Judaism. Well, the Old Testament may, in this sense, be Jewish, but it's also true that Jesus was Jewish, Paul was Jewish, likely all 12 of the original apostles were Jewish. The Christian faith grew out of the Jewish faith. Their history is our history. Number 4, isn't this like saying we should ignore history that's old? Isn't that what makes it history? Old history is still history. We can only truly understand and appreciate what Jesus did for us if we understand the events that led up to his life and sacrifice. Number 3, I have to agree with this one, but I would argue that we're kidding ourselves if we think we know a fraction of the immensity of God now either. Number 2, this one particularly bothers me. Does this mean that the old God who existed since the beginning of time was replaced by a different God? What happened to the original God? Mandatory retirement? Or did God go to anger management? In the book of Malachi, verse 3:6, the Bible tells us that God said, I, the Lord, do not change. Number 1, while some conditions of the Old Testament contracts may no longer be in effect, this does not mean the book is not important. As J. Carl Laney from Western Seminary said, the New Testament was never given to replace the Old Testament, but rather to complete its story. Let's instead look at some of the reasons why I think the Old Testament remains relevant and is very important for us to read. As I mentioned in the beginning, the Old Testament is where we meet God for the first time. We hear the story of how God introduces God's self to humanity. We hear what God's mission is in God's own words, and we hear from God what our role will be in that mission. Awesome. Next, Jesus' death and resurrection brought us, the Gentiles, into God's promises. The Old Testament tells of these promises when God originally makes them to the Jewish ancestors. The authors of the New Testament clearly thought the Old Testament is important because they talk about it so much. Now, footnoting and word-for-word quoting were not done as much back when the New Testament was written, so it's a little tricky to get an exact number of the times the New Testament alludes to or quotes the Old Testament, but the internet sites I looked at all agree that the number is over 800 times. Jesus himself tells us that he did not make the Old Testament irrelevant. In Matthew 5:17, when he says, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are often referred to as the law, and 17 other books of the Old Testament are the prophets, so he's talking about the Old Testament. And if the New Testament tells us how Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament, how can you fully understand the fulfillment if you don't know what it fulfills? That would be like watching the last 10 minutes of a movie and thinking you know the whole story because you know how it ends. You'd miss hearing of the chain of events that led up to the point. You wouldn't encounter all the characters and experience their trials and fears, and you likely wouldn't care as much about the ending as you would if you had experienced the drama leading up to it. To see that the Bible tells a single story from beginning to end, you need to consider all of it and not just the last few chapters. One of my seminary professors jokingly called the New Testament the appendix of the Bible. Hi, Dr. Russell. In the coming weeks, we'll look at how the story of God begins and then unfolds in the Old Testament. We'll meet the major players and we'll see how they have great faith and strengths and great weaknesses and failures. We'll see how the Old Testament sets the stage for the coming of Jesus. I hope that this week has convinced you that the Old Testament is worth looking at and that the coming weeks make you come to love it as much as I do. Well, that's what I think of the Old Testament. What reasons do you see why we should or should not read the Old Testament?